Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the December meeting of the Gene Winter Northeast chapter of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. I'm Victor Mastone. I'm the chairman of the chapter and president of the Mass Archaeological Society. You're all joining us tonight for this about this, that it's hard to believe it's decades. And he was just, I think, ending his undergraduate, beginning his graduate career in lovely Newcastle, New Hampshire, as we were diving. But I'll do a little more introduction to Mike. He's currently teaching at Austin P University in Tennessee. Fortunately survived. They weren't affected by the storms, so that's good to know. Michael and I have worked together. Actually, he's been a permittee of mine for a number of years, as well as we've collaborated a little bit. He's worked both regionally. He's worked in the Northeast. He's worked in the Tennessee Valley, I think. Did some Civil War work there.
Civil War Rex.
He actually worked internationally, so he's kind of a well-rounded maritime archaeologist, as well as a well-known maritime historian. So with that, I want to just do a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll go forward. We're working on our spring calendar. I just have to look at my calendar now to tell you. Our next meeting is in January, and the speaker is going to be Anna Opashinsky. Anna was actually one of my field school students several years ago. She works now for PAL, I believe, but had worked for the Park Service and for Plymouth Plantation. I'm not sure what she's talking about, except that she's a UMass Boston graduate, so we always have space for them in our speakers program. Right now we have speakers for January, February, March, April. I'm working on the May speaker now. It really depends on whether they're going to do an in-person or a remote. The speaker I have, I don't want to divulge much, but I don't think she can do an in-person, so we'll see for May. For those of you that have not renewed your chapter dues that were due back in May, come on, loosen up that purse, send us our $6 for this year. You're halfway through and you haven't paid yet. And for those of you that are interested, remember that the Mass Archaeological Society also love your membership. So those dues are due anytime, but $30 a year, and for seniors, $20, and for students, $20. And for speakers, free, but you'll get that later, Michael.
Oh, excellent.
So I can't think of any other things except to tell you that the Robbins Museum and the Society has been very fortunate in the past several months with its recovery money. We've received yet another state grant to help us with operating funds, which is quite unusual. And we're getting ready to submit the first report on our veterans grant. So hopefully you'll see other progress going on there. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Michael Tuttle, really a New England boy at heart. So take it away, Mike.
Great, thank you, Vic. I appreciate that. I'm Michael Tuttle. I'll be your host today for a talk about searching for the Serapis. Now, I assume I hit share screen, Lindsay, to go to my
Yes, hit share screen, the green thing, and then you should be able to select the PowerPoint.
Okay, I think I selected my PowerPoint. Oh, can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, you just have to put it into the slide. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right, today we will be talking about the Serapis Project, searching for a lost Revolutionary era warship. I'm not sure how much you folks know about John Paul Jones, the American Revolution, the American Revolutionary Navy. But hopefully you'll get a little information today. All right, Serapis. HMS Serapis was a British frigate, a fifth-rate class vessel that carried 44 guns and was built during the war and launched in 1779. So it was a brand spanking new vessel right out of the gate. And what makes this vessel important is its association with John Paul Jones' Battle of Flamborough Head, which I will get into. But I want to talk about the vessel itself, because the Battle of Flamborough Head was the most contentious ship-to-ship battle of the American Revolution, at least with the Americans and the British. The French, that's a whole other deal. But Serapis had some modifications or technological innovations on it that made her basically armed and dangerous. Normal ships have cannons on them, and that's the main armament that is used for battle. However, in 1772, at the Carron Cannon Works in Scotland, they invented a new, smaller type of cannon, and you can see that over on the right side, and it's called a carronade. An 18-pound cannon, and the Serapis had 20 18-pounders, 20, I think, 10-pounders or 16-pounders, and 6 other cannon are on it. And a cannon, a 18-pound cannon, needs a lot of troops to, or a lot of sailors to move it, because it's a huge, heavy chunk of metal. A carronade is a much smaller cannon. It serves the same purpose. And British military tactics were basically to get aside the enemy vessel and just bash it to bits. And your traditional cannon could do that perfectly fine. However, you would need at least 8 or 10 sailors to move a 18-pounder because they were so heavy. A carronade was actually much shorter, much smaller, and a crew of 4 to 6 could actually work it. And the Serapis actually had carronades on it as well. So it had these ship smashing guns along with its regular guns. And because of the British tactics of getting close to the enemy and engaging, using a carronade, which a half mile would do absolutely nothing. Your accuracy was gone. But if you were within 50 or 100 yards, a carronade was a much better weapon to use. And Serapis had carronades on that as well. John Paul Jones, why does he figure in here? Well, John Paul Jones is considered the father of the American Navy, in part because of his activity during the American Revolution. He was not an American. He was born in Scotland to a gardener, and he went to sea as a child and worked his way up the ranks. Actually, a captain died in the Caribbean, and he was the only one who knew how to sail at home. And when he got home, the ship owner was like, hey, you seem to be a good captain. And so he worked his way up the ranks basically as a self-made man, from a gardener's son to a captain. Unfortunately, somewhere in around 1773, he had an issue or two with a mutinous crew member and struck the person in the head with I do believe it was a bucket. Unfortunately, the person died, and the problem for Jones was he was a local on the island in the Caribbean, and Jones had no, I don't want to say pull or whatever, and so he thought he would be charged with murder rather than putting down a mutiny, and he came to America, where his brother was in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And that was 1774. When the American Revolution started, for various reasons, Jones felt that he wanted to offer his services to the new United States. This whole idea of freedom, I guess, really was, in his soul. And actually, when he was a sailor, he did do a blackbirding voyage. That it was what was called a slaving voyage, and he mentioned in his when you read any biography of his, is that he found that the most distressing and disgusting trade that anybody could be in. So maybe he had some ideas of freedom, but he offered his services to the United States. The unfortunate part is the United States at the beginning of the revolution had no navy. And when it was started, the American Congress had to buy commercial ships and retrofit those for naval purposes. Now, when you're fighting against the British, you have the greatest navy in the world at that point in time. You either got to be crazy or motivated to join the Navy, but Jones did. So some kudos there. Well, he was a Navy commander. He was with the first expedition to the Bahamas, where under Hopkins, the Americans did get a bunch of gunpowder and some cannons that were brought back to the United States. Then he got his own ship, went up and raided ships in Canada, a lot of fishing vessels. He was a very active commander. A lot of the early American commanders were not, they were more political appointees than seamen. And again, Jones worked his way up the ranks and doing many of the things he did. He was appointed to a vessel called the Ranger, which was sent to France. And when he was there, he did sail around England and cause a few problems. But when he returned to France, his vessel was taken away from him. So he was kind of put on shore for a bit. When we talk about the American Revolution, you think of Lexington, Concord, the Siege of Boston, the Battle of New York, or the Southern Campaign, or Yorktown, or the loss of Philadelphia. Many Americans don't think that the American Revolutionary War was a worldwide war, and it actually was. The United States, was breaking away from Great Britain, and the French, who had always had a problem with the British, were quite supportive of the United States. And their support became actualized in 1778 after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And France actually jumped in with the United States. Spain, being a ally of France, did not necessarily join the United States in the battle against England, but it allied itself with France due to the royal connections there. A little later, the Dutch got into the war. The Netherlands had always been a free trade state, and the British somehow didn't like this tiny little island in the Caribbean called St. Eustatia, where the French and the Spanish would send arms and guns and cannons and gunpowder, and Americans would pick it up. And the British basically started a war with the Netherlands as well. So the great maritime nations of Spain, France, and the Netherlands jumped into the American Revolution and basically fighting for the American side. But there were also other areas that weren't at war against Great Britain, but in the Baltic Sea, you had the League of Armed Neutrality that was Catherine the Great of Russia. I think Denmark and Sweden were in this league that said, Britain, you got your ships, your navy, you're great, but just quit being so bossy, or we're going to jump in this war as well. So Great Britain, as an island nation, had a lot of issues with the American Revolution. It just wasn't colonies fighting for their independence anymore. It became a worldwide war, again, with the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish involved in the League of Armed Neutrality. And that League of Armed Neutrality in the Baltic will fit into the story of the Serapis as well. Oops, excuse me. All right, well, let's talk about the League of Armed Neutrality. When the United States, when the United Colonies broke off from Great Britain lost a huge, massive resource, and those resources were forests and naval stores. From the south, you got pitch from trees from New Hampshire and Maine. You had beautiful tall pine trees that could be used as naval stores for, masts for ships and yards for ships. Hemp was also grown in the United States, and hemp was used to make cordage, line, rope, cable, whatever you want to call it. All these supplies were lost to Great Britain, and as a alternate source of these supplies came from the Baltic, the trees of Sweden, the hemp of Poland, the pitch coming from the trees as well from Sweden. So the British had to get their naval stores from the Baltic region to help supply their navy. And the British Navy was, again, fighting the French, the Spanish, the Americans, and supporting the tens of thousands of troops that the British had stationed in North America. So these Baltic fleets were unbelievably important to the success, or I should say the mere existence of the British Navy. So in 1779, Serapis was actually launched, a brand spanking new ship. It was one of 25 44-gun frigates, fifth rates, that were designed by Thomas Slade in 1770. And these ships went through the American Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, and did very, very good service. But the very first mission of the Serapis was to sail to the Baltic to escort a convoy of these needed resources back to Great Britain. And there were actually two convoys, the Serapis and the Countess of Scarborough. Well, the Serapis is off sitting in Elsinore Castle, waiting for the vessels to congregate. And well, Pearson, who is the commander of the Serapis, is there waiting for the vessels. Jones had showed up in France. He had done his first foray around Great Britain in the Ranger, and then he got a ship taken away from him by a superior commander. Jones was, I guess, a fairly good politician, because he managed to get Benjamin Franklin, who was American's minister in France, to get the French to give Jones a vessel. It was an old beat up French East Indiaman called the Duc de Duras, to give this to Jones so Jones could again attempt to take the fight to the British. Well, Jones gets this old East Indiaman that's like 11, 12, 13 years old. It's been around at the Horn of Africa at least 3 times. It's not in the best condition, but he does his best to get the ship ready for battle. And he does. And the French actually give him a squadron, the Alliance, the Surf, and 3 or 4 other vessels in the squadron, to basically attack the British. And on Jones's vessel, he has literally a polyglot crew. He has Americans, because there are many American sailors that were on shore in France. He has Frenchmen. There are Swedes, there are Portuguese, there are Scotsmen, there are British, there's some Irish folk as well. I mean, it is truly a kind of an international crew. And it's like, okay, you're going to go off into battle with this crew. Do they all understand English? Can you communicate with them? And you're going to be working with some other ships that are mostly French, with a couple of Americans as well. And Jones ends up sailing around Great Britain. He causes some consternation. But in the fall of 1779, he's coming down the east coast of England near Scarborough by the River Hull. And on September 23rd, as you can see from the slide, somebody in Jones's squadron sees this Baltic convoy going towards England. And to intercept a Baltic convoy, to take that, would have been a fantastic feat for Jones. It would have denied the British much needed naval supplies. The captain of the Serapis, again, Pearson, basically, he was close enough to England that he sent signals for all the ships to sail to Scarborough Castle to be under the protection of Scarborough Castle. And the Serapis and Countess of Scarborough basically went towards Jones' squadron to try to keep him from, taking prizes from the various ships. Jones's crew and the squadron, head towards these two British vessels, and the British vessel, depending on your maritime historian, people will tell you, well, the British had all kinds of people on their vessels as well. They would take anybody, Europeans, etc., and so on. With the Serapis Project, we actually have the roles of the crew from the Serapis. And yeah, they're John Smiths and Bill Joneses and, Johnny Wrights. They are Englishmen, born and bred. You can find very few Germanic or Latin names. And so the crew is mostly British, single nation. And compared to what Jones has is this Earth Stats put together crew. Well, the battle starts with the Serapis opening up on the Bonhomme Richard. And I should mention that the Bonhomme Richard, the Duc de Duras was renamed Bonhomme Richard by Jones in honor of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard Almanac. That's why it's the Bonhomme Richard. The Serapis opens up on the Bonhomme Richard with her guns, and the Bonhomme Richard responds. The unfortunate part about that is when Jones was given the Duc de Duras, this old French East Indiaman, he was also given a bunch of old cannon, and several of his 18-pounders actually exploded on first ignition. And Jones is like, this isn't good. We can't even use these cannons. So the 44-gun frigate Serapis literally had an advantage over Bonhomme Richard immediately. But the ships kind of circle. They do a dance of sailing, firing at each other. And in general, it looks like the British are going to, take the battle. The rest of the squadron that's with Jones, one pairs off with the Countess of Scarborough, and the other vessels kind of circle. And there's a vessel called the Atlantis Alliance under the command of this French commander. Now I completely forgot his name. But the Pierre Landis, and Pierre Landis was kind of circling on the outside of this fight between Serapis and Bonhomme Richard, waiting for, whatever to take place, and then to swoop in at the last moment to maybe take the glory for himself. And it is known that he actually shot indiscriminately and hit both the Serapis and the Bonhomme Richard. So there's some things going on there, but the battle was unbelievably fierce. It lasted for over 3.5 hours, and 50% of the men on both sides were casualties. It's dead or are wounded. It is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. And each of the crews, I think the crew of the Serapis was about 320. The crew of the Bonhomme Richard was 280. They're about 300 each. About 300 men were killed or wounded in this battle. That's how fierce it was. And the battle was, I don't know how you say honors of war, but kind of, I guess back in the day, they had honors of war. These are wooden ships with cotton or hemp sails held together by ropes with pitch and tar. And these cannons firing at each other, threw off their wadding and in flames, and the ships caught on fire. And at one point, they actually stopped the battle. Somebody actually calls timeout, stops the battle, and they put out the fires on their vessels, and then they go back to war, to killing each other. The American tactic in the battle was kind of the French tactic, and that was to shoot at the sails and the masts of the enemy. And if you can disable an enemy's motivation or locomotion, then you can take your time and destroy the enemy's hull and take the vessel. The British tactic, as I kind of intimated earlier, with their cannons and then going to carronades, was basically to get close and to bash your enemy to bits. And the Americans did a very good job at what they intended to do. They basically, during the battle, they dismasted the Serapis. They shot at the mast with their cannons, and the main mast went over the side. The British, they were expert at their hull bashing. And there's a point, and you can see in this painting by Gilkerson, there's a point where the British are shooting into an empty ship because they actually hold it on both sides. And this picture by William Gilkerson, where's my cursor? Okay, there it is. You can actually see here that on the outside would be the port side of the vessel, there is like a explosion coming out of it, as a representation of how old the Bonhomme Richard was. Well, this battle, as I mentioned, lasted for about 3.5 hours. And at one point during the battle, the carnage was so great that a few of the subalterns on the Bonhomme Richard couldn't find Jones or any other commander, and they thought they were all dead because the 50% casualty rate, a lot of people are getting dead. So they actually called for quarters. And when Captain Pearson on the Serapis hears this, he says, do you call for quarters? Shall I cease fire? And Jones hears this. And this is where that famous quote comes. And nobody knows exactly what Jones says. But the famous quote is, "I have not yet begun to fight." Comes out of this particular instance. Jones was also pretty mad at these two junior officers. He actually took his pistols out and literally threw them at these guys and said, "I've not yet begun to fight," and the fight continued. Well, as the carnage was so horrible on both of these vessels, they were both in very horrible condition. The British commander basically was like, "I've done my job. The convoy has gotten away. It is under the protection of Scarborough Castle. This death is useless." And the British actually gave up in this battle, which was pretty phenomenal. And this is during the American Revolution. This is basically the pinnacle of American naval arms, you could say. The American Navy did not necessarily do that well in I think it is August of this year, 1779. We had the disastrous Penobscot expedition, when a bunch of United Colony vessels, state vessels from Massachusetts, privateers went up to the Penobscot River to attempt to remove the British from Fort George at Castine, Pentagoet, whatever you want to call it. It was a huge fiasco for the Americans. Every ship was lost there. And the battle between the Serapis and Bonhomme Richard happened shortly after that. And it basically made Jones pretty famous. And as a propaganda tool, it was pretty marvelous. Well, Jones transfers his flag over to the Serapis because the Bonhomme Richard is in such poor condition that when they start sailing away from Flamborough Head towards the east, towards the Netherlands, Bonhomme Richard actually sinks. The Bonhomme Richard is lost somewhere in the North Sea. And there have been, literally every year you hear somebody saying, "I found the Bonhomme Richard, I found the Bonhomme Richard." But they can never prove it. The Bonhomme Richard has been, since I've been involved with the Serapis Project, the Bonhomme Richard has been found at least 5 different times by various people claiming it. So Jones has to transfer all his crew over to the Serapis, and now they're on the vessel with the British crew. Again, this picture is a good representation of the damage that Serapis undertook during the battle. It lost its main mast. They had the jury rig mast and jury rig sails, and sail this across the North Sea. Well, the Battle of Flamborough Head was actually so close to shore that people went to the cliffs and watched it. The unfortunate part for Jones and the Americans was that people went up and watched it, and the word got out that Jones and the American fleet, or I should say squadron, wasn't fleet, was in British waters. And now just about every British naval commander who was worth his salt in the North Sea was looking for Jones, and he basically had to get out of town as quick as possible, because if he was caught, he did some very interesting things to the British at Whitehaven and a few other things. The British saw Jones as a pirate, not necessarily as a lawful commander. So Jones had to get out of there. And instead of going back to France, he sailed the Serapis to the Netherlands. And at this point in time, the Netherlands was a neutral nation, and vessels that were at war were allowed to go into neutral nations for repair, et cetera, and so on. So Jones takes the Serapis to the Netherlands to get it refitted. Unfortunately for Jones, the cards were kind of stacked against him. The French wanted their ship back, and Jones, like, the Bonhomme Richard's at the bottom of the North Sea, and I don't think Jones was very quick, or he was just playing, and he's like, oh, you know, that's the ship's gone. And the French are like, no, we want our ship back. And Jones had to give up ownership of the Serapis. And again, the Serapis was the greatest prize ever taken by Americans during the Revolutionary War. So he transferred his flag to the Ariel. And again, the English were getting on to the Dutch about having Jones come out, because they wanted Jones to come out because they had half their fleet there waiting to pounce on him. Jones transferred his flag to the Alliance and sailed out of the Netherlands, I think in December, and the British didn't catch him. The French now were in possession of Serapis, and they later took Serapis to Lorient, which is in Brittany in France, to recondition it. Again, the battle damage on the Serapis was pretty phenomenal. And they raised it. By raising, they basically took a full deck off the vessel. So from going from a 44 gun ship, which had, 20 guns on the first deck, 20 guns on the second deck, and then some guns up on the poop deck up in this area, they basically took this deck off. So now, instead of being a 44 gun frigate, it was more of a 20 gun corvette. Excuse me. Well, the battle, before I go on with the French taking over the Serapis, the Battle of Flamborough Head was a very important turning point in the American Revolution. What you're seeing here is some propaganda from World War II to buy war bonds and war stamps. And I guess it was their Revolutionary War series. And the Battle of Lexington, obviously that was the start of the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence, Americans are declaring independence. Below that is Washington crossing the Delaware, Washington's first real victory against enemies. And right after that, you see John Paul Jones, I have not yet begun to fight. These are some of the touchstones and turning points in the American Revolution. And that is what makes Bonhomme Richard and Serapis two very important naval vessels, at least in my mind, to be considered. And well, again, the world at war. The French got Serapis. Put down there. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, the French took control of Serapis. And again, the American Revolution did become a world war. It wasn't only fought in the colonies. Over here, it was fought in the Caribbean. It was fought in the Mediterranean, Majorca and the islands. It was fought down here at Gibraltar, in India, and in Asia. The French and the Dutch had their possessions, and the English were fighting the French in India, and the French had an admiral. One of their actually best admirals was a gentleman named Suffren, who was working in the Indian Ocean. Where is that cursor? Yeah, it was working in the Indian Ocean, trying to protect the French interests over here off of India. Well, the Serapis was reconditioned by the French. As I mentioned, they reseated it, took a deck off. One of the technological advantages on the Serapis was that its hull was also coppered. And by putting copper hull sheathing on a vessel, it, number one, made a vessel faster. If any of you have boats out there, you know every summer you got to paint the anti-fouling paint on the bottom, and it usually has some kind of copper materials, copper elements in it, and that inhibits the growth of hair and barnacles and other such things on ship bottoms. For a naval ship, having speed is a force multiplier. If you can go faster than your enemy, you can either catch up or run away from them. If they're bigger, run away. If they're smaller, you catch up to them. And Serapis was coppered. So this is an extremely important part of the archaeology as well. Well, Serapis left France and it was sent to the Indian Ocean in order to support Suffren. It was bringing basically guns, information, and we'll talk about some of the archaeology we found as well in the paying ballast. And Serapis sailed, around the Atlantic. When it got to South America, or excuse me, not South America, South Africa, the captain actually stopped and let some of the crew off because they were ill. Then they got to Madagascar. Right about here is a tiny little island called Ste Marie, where the French had an East India office, and that's where the ultimate demise of Serapis was. Well, when you're looking for a shipwreck, one of the things that can help you find it is if you have a great documentary record on, number one, what the ship was, number two, where the ship went down or was lost. We went to the, actually I had a friend, Michael Dunn. I went to St. Andrews in Scotland. He was one of my buddies there, and he does a lot of work at the PR. It was the Public Record Office. Today it is now the, today it is now the National Archives of Great Britain. But we got the records of when Serapis was built, and these are the contract numbers of how big the Serapis should be. And these are the as-built numbers of what the Serapis should be. So we know what we're looking for. And then we did some research in the French archives. Here's at Cape de Bon Experience, the Cape of Good Hope, where Lieutenant LaRoche leaves some of his troops or some of his 6 sailors. And then we have the French record that has the basically the court-martial record of Lieutenant LaRoche. Whenever a naval commander loses his vessel, there is a court-martial. It doesn't mean it was good or bad or something was wrong. They just do an investigation. And we got the French records that indicated that Serapis was lost off of Madagascar on a tiny little island right there. And that tiny little island is called Isle Ste Marie. the harbor at Isle Ste Marie, where today even there is the remains of a French fort that is now used by the Malagasy government. But here is the harbor of Ebudifutata. The Serapis was anchored when it was lost. So we got this information, and then we again went and got historic maps and charts of the harbor of Ebudifutata. The town is here today. This is Iliotma Dam. This is a larger scale map. There's Iliotma Dam. The anchorage for the harbor was here. And so when we decided to do our survey, we used these old historic maps to try to determine where to do our survey. The town is up here. Again, the French fort is here. So we determined, you put your ship as close as possible. As built, the Serapis drew 16 foot when she was launched. And we figured that they would anchor in a 3-to-1 depth ratio. So at about 45 to 50 foot. And that is where we conducted our initial magnetometer survey in the harbor. And basically, to do a survey, you have your boat and you have your magnetometer. And we used a magnetometer initially because one of these war vessels will have tons and tons of iron on it in the form of cannon. Each cannon weighs 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pounds. Each anchor weighs 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. All the iron and metal fastenings. So you're going to have a huge, monstrous magnetic anomaly associated with this vessel. Again, the Serapis was about 148 foot on the lower deck. So we figured if we did 100-foot line spacing, sooner or later we would run over the remains of the vessel. And what you do when you do a magnetometer survey is the Earth is basically a giant magnet. It has its own magnetic field around it. And when you introduce huge chunks of metal or electric impulses, but they didn't have any electricity back in that day. So the only thing we're looking for are huge chunks of metal, that you find disturbances in the Earth's natural magnetic field due to these localized chunks of iron, and they're called anomalies. And we basically went back and forth in the harbor until we found some anomalies, and basically made a contour map. We also used DGPS navigation because when you're out at sea, it's really hard to tell where you are. So you have satellite navigation to be able to tell you exactly where you are. And then you put in your layback for your magnetometer. And we did our survey, and then we got back to shore, and we combined our positioning data with our magnetometer data. We found areas where there were magnetic anomalies, and decided which targets would be there for dive time. One thing we didn't do is use a side scan sonar, which if we would have used it, it probably would have helped us as well. But the thought was Madagascar is a rocky island, and we thought using a side scan sonar, we'd just be seeing a heck of a lot of coral. And there's a ton of coral there. There's a heck of a lot of coral. But where the wreck was, actually a side scan would have helped. But then we moved to our dive operations. This is actually us out there, Pritchard Smith, Michael Creever, Greg Cook, that's myself, Kelly Bumpus, and one of our boatmen there helping us. And we go to the site and do our diving. And the first site we dived was what we called the copper site. It was kind of really, really interesting. And again, I mentioned that Madagascar is a rocky country, but when you are on shore and you see the rocks are all angular and sharp, and they're actually, seem to have a high iron content as well. That caused us a little problem with the mag, but that's a whole other story. But we found these round worn rocks, kind of like beach cobble or river cobble, that were totally out of place for the environment. And in association with these rocks and cobble, we also found this, and this is the most important thing there. It was sheets of crumpled up copper. And the way the Serapis was lost in the harbor of Futata was LaRoche went to shore. One of his junior officers was down below cutting the brandy, which was part of the sailor's ration at that point in time, was cutting the brandy. Unfortunately, the person holding the candle or the lantern dropped the lantern in this overproof brandy, and it basically started liquid fire. And as they poured water in to put out the fire in the barrels, well, water is more dense than alcohol. It goes right to the bottom. And now all of a sudden liquid fire is going over the top of these barrels. And the barrels started to burn. And as they did, the liquid fire started to go to the lowest place on the vessel. And unfortunately, the lowest place on the vessel in the bilges is where the magazine is. And the magazine is where the gunpowder is. Just gravity doing its job. So they called for an abandoned ship, and the ship actually, the fire reached the magazine and the ship actually blew up. We believe this area where we found crumpled up copper and ballast stone was during the initial explosion. It blew out a portion of the bottom of the vessel, and that's what caused this scatter of ballast and copper. And there's no wood here. The water's 80 degrees, over 250 odd years ago. I mean, Torredo Nervalis just destroyed all the wood in this shallow water. And this was found at about 45 foot. And we did this excavation in 2004. We actually went back in 2008. We were going to focus on the what we call the copper site, but we got some information from our local contacts there that there was something that we might be interested in. And this was the area where we dove. And this is about 300 meters due west of the copper site. And interestingly enough, the winds in Madagascar, in the northern hemisphere, at least where we are, the winds are generally come from the west and go to the east. In Madagascar, the winds go from the east to the west. And literally 300 meters to the west is this shipwreck. And we figured when the shipwreck exploded, it blew out the bottom, but the ship didn't sink like you see on cartoons. It floated with the wind and wave and tides until it filled up with water and finally settled. And in 75 foot of water, we found these bricks. And these bricks, we believe, are indicative of the galley of the ship. And we also found these ballast bars. And these ballast bars, again, were paying ballast. We believe they're lead because we took a magnet down with us, and a magnet did not stick to these ballast bars. We believe they're lead that could have been used in ammunition for muskets when they finally got to India. But the magnet stuck to the cannon, it stuck to the anchor, it stuck to all that iron stuff, but it did not stick to these ballast bars. Some other things we found, yes, the intention of this vessel was a war vessel, and we found 11 different cannon on the site. We attempted to measure cannon, and we had all kinds of different sizes of cannon. In the the court-martial records, the French did attempt to salvage some cannon, salvage some anchor, and some other things on the vessel. But we did find 10 remaining cannon on what we found. And we also found about 140 foot long pile of debris. This is all contained, very well contained, and it rose about 6 foot, 7 foot off the seabed as well. So there's a giant mound. It would have made a great side scan sonar image, but that's for another day. So these are the things we found. And one of the most important things we found is rigging this 140 foot by about 50 foot mound coming off the bottom is copper hull sheathing. And just about anywhere you go on the margins of this vessel, you see this. You can see some of the ballast stone those ballast bricks I was talking about. Usually they're placed at the lower parts of the vessel, and this ballast stone is above them, so you can put your water, wine, and other stores, and use this smaller rock kind of as dunnage. But all around the site, you find this copper hull sheathing, and we actually brought up a piece, and it is about 97% copper. And that's very important because copper hull sheathing was only used between about 1761 with the experiment of the alarm till about 1830, when other metals like Muntz metals were used. And copper is great for what it does, but also it caused some problems they didn't know about galvanic reaction, having copper next to iron. But this was a great indicator that we were pretty sure we're on the Serapis, because no other shipwreck sank during this period. And we have a copper hull sheathing, which again, as I mentioned, is pretty important. One thing we did do, because the wreck is down at 75 foot, we used the 80-foot tables. We're in a tiny island off of Madagascar. The medical facilities weren't there, so we were only limited to about 30 minutes dive per person per day. And our crew, as you saw there before, we'd go down 2 at a time. We set a baseline and tried to draw up what we found. Again, with the cursor, you can see we found a bunch of cannon, ballast bars, anchor, and north is actually to the bottom of the page. The copper hull sheathing, you can see all around. And so this was our initial site plan of the wreck. We actually do hope to go back this year, do a side scan sonar mosaic over the wreck site, do some photogrammetry over it to document what's there before any true excavation does start. And that's about the search for the Serapis, and we are pretty sure we believe we found it. I guess we can open the floor for questions.
Perfect. Thank you. So yeah, everyone, if you guys have questions, you can put them into the chat and I'll relay them to Michael and everything. While we wait for questions to come in, what was your favorite thing that you have found in this wreck or anything like that?
The best thing, the best find was when we found the copper, the original copper site, because it was doing the magnetic survey. Madagascar itself, if you look at the rock around Madagascar, it's like all red, rusty, and irony. It has a high content iron. So we actually had there was a lot of fuzz in the data. And we picked 3 sites to look at. And one was actually this seamound that came up out of nowhere. That would give you an anomaly. Then we found some modern trash, and then we found the area where we found the cobble and the initial copper. And that was just like, yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. That's the only ship that we know of that would have copper. Why is this dislocated here? So that was like, put us on the trail, and like, dogs on the hunt. It was like, yeah, we know we're going to find it. We know it's here. It's got to be somewhere. And then in the subsequent years, we found the whole wreck, and then it was just like, yeah, we just got another wreck to deal with.
One of the questions that's come in is, sort of related to one of the wrecks you were talking earlier, what has been the response about finding this? Or are there anyone who's like, oh, you didn't really find it, like how you found 5 of
No.
that other ship?
Yeah, no, it's been like crickets. Everybody seems to be interested in the Bonhomme Richard. And it's like the Bonhomme Richard, that was old, knackered, beat up vessel. The Serapis is brand spanking new. It was the prize, the greatest prize taken by the Americans during the war. And it's just like crickets. I gave a talk at one of the, every other year, the Naval Academy has a symposium. I figured that, John Paul Jones, his remains are sitting there in the crypt. And it's just like the guy who took this vessel is laying right, within 50 yards of me speaking. And they were just like, yeah, it's, I don't know what makes one more important than the other, because they're both extremely important in American history.
Cool. Let me just see, sorry. So I have a lot of thank yous. Excellent talk.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, those were, I think, most of the questions everyone had. But Vic, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I think Dick has a question. He's gesturing us.
Oh.
Dick Miller.
Yeah. Well, sorry, we got a comment from Marty. He says, thank you, Mike. Very interesting talk. He was involved with Clive Cussler and trying to find the, I'm going to mess this up, Bonhomme Richard, and good working on finding the Serapis. And yeah, I was about to make a joke about that, Marty, because he's like, I know where you can find a good side scan sonar. So yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, don't look at Marty when you're like, we didn't do a side scan sonar.
Yeah, that was our model. Sometimes you got to think about things and things will come back. But I appreciate that, Marty. Actually, Clive did give us money to go back during our 2004 season. He's a great supporter of, or was, God bless his soul, a great supporter of maritime archaeology.
Well, I do have a question for you, Mike. So you said you might go back this summer?
Yeah, we've been told by a group that they would support us if we wanted to go back this summer. And I told them the number we needed. And they were like, we can raise that for you. And I'm just like, really? Because I've been beaten. When I was working in CRM, I don't think people took me seriously. Now that I'm a doctor and I teach university, all of a sudden I get so much more respect. It's like, I'm the same guy, but I guess it's that perception thing. And so having my university quals and all that stuff, I guess, hey, if it's going to pay off, God bless it.
Thank you. Lindsay, unmute Dick Miller. I think he wanted to ask a question.
Oh, okay. Well, we do have a...
All right, Dick, you're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
What I was trying to say is chat doesn't work. I don't know if it worked for other people.
Oh, I'm getting other people's chats.
Okay, when I hit chat, it doesn't do anything.
Oh.
All right, as long as you're getting questions from other people.
Yeah, no, Zoom just doesn't like Dick. Sorry.
Okay.
Speaking of things coming in, we have a question from Anne Marie. Is the eventual goal to excavate the wreck? And if so, where would that material be curated?
Yeah, the wreck, it sank under the French flag, although they abandoned ship. Madagascar was a French colony, and during the period of decolonialization, the French basically said, everything of ours is yours. So legally, the wreck belongs to the Malagasy government, or the Malagasy people, or you could say the Malagasy government. We are actually working with the University of Antananarivo in Madagascar through the Institute of Art, the Institute of Civilizations, Art, and Archaeology. And many of their students, every year we go over there, take students from the university to bring with us. Again, the resources, the underwater archaeological resources in Madagascar are phenomenal. They go back to like some of the first Portuguese vessels breaking into the Indian Ocean, all the way to modern 20th century wrecks. So we're working with the university. We did get some material and actually brought it back to America. We had it, conserved. And last time we went back, we took what we brought with us and gave it back to the museum. So it all belongs to the people of Madagascar. Our next venture, we want to use modern technology, use it all: side scan, sonar, underwater photogrammetry. I mean, the things that can be done underwater. The technology in the past 20 years since we first found this is just leaps and bounds above where it was. So we want to make a base map of what's there before we start any excavation. And if we do any excavation, it will be extremely limited. It will be based upon what we can conserve. Because once you take something out from underwater, it begins to corrode, erode, destroy itself. Iron has all kinds of problems. Even ceramics and glass from this era, is filled with salts. And if you take it out of the water without desalinating it, it'll just turn into dust in a few years. So, but there is on Isle Madame, that tiny little island that I kind of pointed out when I showed the map of the harbor. There is a tiny cultural museum there. There is some tourist traffic, and again, working with the Malagasy government, if we do bring anything up, it will go to their local museum to help encourage, ecotourism in the area to help the local people. The thing, I get the great history out of it and to write it up and all that other stuff, and the Malagazys will hopefully get a display which may attract people. Today, mostly the tourists there are French or European, but again, if people know that a great American shipwreck is there, it might have more Americans going to that part of the world as well.
You are lucky though that you're dealing with Madagascar over French bureaucracy. If it was still under them.
Yeah, well, the Malagasy bureaucracy is a bureaucracy to say the least, but working with the university, we seem to have a lot of inside knowledge and help. People direct us to exactly where we need to go, what needs to happen, and when we need a permit, it's like they know who to take care of, and so it's very helpful.
Perfect. I think that is all the questions. Do you know Dick Sweetie?
Dick Sweet was the man who started the Serapis Project, and I failed. Thank you for bringing that up, Marty, because I failed to mention that. Dick Sweet was the originator of the Serapis Project. It was his idea to go there. I worked for Dick when we started this project. Unfortunately, one season we went there, there was some issues, in talking about bureaucracy. There were some issues because another group was over there doing archaeology that really wasn't archaeology if you go by the United Nations UNESCO investigation of what they did. But I came home and Dick was there in Madagascar, and he actually died of malaria, which was a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, no, that's very sad. Anything else? Anyone else?
It's probably why I didn't bring it up.
Well, thank you, Michael. This was excellent. This was really good. We will be posting this to our YouTube page, to the Mass Archaeology YouTube page, for anyone who may have missed some of this or want to rewatch it. Next month, again, we have Anna Openshinsky on Tuesday, January 18th, right, Vic? Isn't that the date? And everything. So yeah, so thank you. And Michael, Vic will be harassing you for your address because as a thank you, you will be getting a membership to Mass Archaeological Society since we can't take our speakers out to lunch or out to dinner.
I prefer lunch.
Yes. And
We'll go on
everyone
at a later
else,
date, Michael.
Fair enough, fair enough.
everyone else, I hope you have, good holiday season. I hope we do not get any nor'easters for those here in Massachusetts or New England, hopefully, and everything. And we will see you in the new year.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Have a wonderful
Yeah.
evening.
And thank you all for listening to an interesting talk. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Michael.